Good morning, everybody. If you could take a seat, please, we'll get going here. Keep on schedule. Welcome to our next breakout session, Gene Editing Insights, the Consumer Perspective. As innovation continues to shape the future of food and agriculture, understanding consumer perception is more important than ever. This session will explore how gene editing is viewed by consumers in the U.S. and globally, and what that means for pork producers. We're pleased to be joined by Charlie Arnott, CEO for the Center for Food Integrity, and Andy Tower, Vice President of International Market Development at the National Pork Board. Please join me in giving them a warm welcome.
Thank you. Well, good morning. Are we on? Yep, we're good. They told me I was going to speak about pre-wean mortality, so I don't know anything about what we're supposed to talk about, so we'll try that later. Great to be with you. My name's Charlie Arnott. Just in terms of context, I spent 11 years as Vice President of Communications and Public Affairs at the cautionary tale of Premium Standard Farm. Some of you may know of that or have heard of it or read about it. And during my time there, we relied on three primary strategies to defend our interests, right? We talked about our science, we talked about our economic impact, and we attacked anybody who attacked us. And kind of felt a diminishing return on that strategy over 10 years, so I left and formed an organization focused on building trust as opposed to defending a position. And so that's what we've been focused on for the last 2+ decades in our work. I served on the NPPC board, served on numerous pork board committees, and so I am quite familiar with the pork industry. And at least one former board member, co-board member, Don Buell, is here. There may be others in the room as well, so please don't throw anything until I'm finished. That would be my only request of the audience today. I'm going to open up and talk a little bit about who we are just in terms of context. Again, we exist solely to help today's food system build trust. You can see the list of organizations that are members of the Center for Food Integrity, including the National Pork Board and many other organizations. You can see the diversity of members, and that's intentional. We want to have organizations that represent the diversity of the food system because seeing all these issues from 360 degrees can be very valuable. You can also see a list of project partners, organizations perhaps that aren't yet members, but have said, we have a particular issue or challenge with something tied to trust, can you help us? And so we will partner with them and find ways to provide those kinds of solutions. I'm going to open today talking about the evolution of truth, because what we think is and is not true helps inform how we think about talking about things like gene editing and other kinds of technology. In agriculture, historically, we've always thought of truth as being driven by science, but truth is a social construct. We have to agree as a society what's going to be true, and what we decide is going to be true is often influenced by how we communicate, the technology we use to communicate, and those who master or control that technology always have greater influence. So we're going to go all the way back to start at the 3rd or 4th century when religious iconography was the communication technology available at that time. And those who had the ability to interpret the frescoes, the murals, and the paintings were given authority to decide what was true in that culture. Not just in the spiritual world, but in the physical world as well, right? The earth is flat, you're not feeling so well, try some leeches, whatever it happened to be. They were the arbiters of truth because they controlled that communication technology. Fast forward about 1,000 years, and the Gutenberg printing press comes into play. Very first time we have mass communication, one to many. It encourages literacy. We can share ideas. We can debate and discuss because we have a common understanding. We're no longer relying on just a handful of authorities to discern what is and is not true. The printing press was essential to Galileo when he launched the scientific revolution in the 1600s. He used the printing press to create scientific journals and scientific societies, and Galileo is credited as being the father of modern science that we still follow today. So that written word, the ability to share information, was essential in creating that science-based information culture that we've relied on for the last 400+ years in Western society. And in 2004, Facebook launched. Right? Everything changed once Facebook launched, again, because of that change in communication technology. I see several of you in this room that are old enough to remember when we only had 3 television networks, ABC, NBC, and CBS. God forbid, I've overcome this, my trauma, with years of therapy. We actually had to get off the couch to change the channel. There were no remotes when I was growing up, right? And in the 22 minutes that each network had to share the news with us every evening, they told us essentially the same stories. Because the media didn't tell us what to think, but they told us what to think about. Right? They selected the 5 or 6 topics that day that were going to be important to society at large. And as a television station or a radio station, you got a license from the government to say we agree and will abide by certain standards in terms of the information we share and how we share that information. So we had a science-based information monoculture supported by mass communication. We had a common understanding, the water cooler conversation around what was important in society. We based our opinions about what was true and not true on science, and we shared the common sense of information. All that changed when we went from mass communication to masses of communicators, where anyone with a cell phone can create content and share it with an infinite audience. Infinite audience can create information and share it with you. Right? It's fundamentally changed the dynamics of how we communicate, and that too then has changed how we define truth. So we used to think about trying to connect with the middle of the bell curve, right? The 70 to 80% are in the middle of the bell curve, but that's now been replaced by an infinite proliferation of microcultures, each of which has their own belief system, their own values, oftentimes their own definition of what is true. The challenge becomes if the green microculture doesn't agree with the red microculture, doesn't agree with the blue microculture, we find it increasingly difficult to have meaningful conversations about what's important in society, because we no longer have that information monoculture, and we no longer agree that science will be the foundation of what we decide is and is not true. Look at the shift in media consumption driven by that change in communication technology. Today, Joe Rogan, single podcaster, has more than 3 times the audience of CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News combined in prime time. Right? One podcaster, more than 3 times the audience of those cable news networks. And if you look at the age demographics of those who are consuming media, the average age of those watching CNN, MSNBC, and Fox all have their Medicare card. The average age of the person watching or viewing Joe Rogan, 24. So if I'm interested in marketing to the future and not the past, where am I spending my time and energy? It's not legacy media, right? It's on all the new media opportunities that we see before us today. And the 2 prominent digital platforms, Meta and X, have both said, we're out of the fact-checking business. We're going to now allow every microculture to decide what is true for themselves. So it's become a very, very different environment, a very challenging environment to have conversations, and where we used to see scientists as the arbiters of authority, the people who would decide what is true, that authority has now been distributed. This was research done by Edelman in late 24, 26 countries excluding China and Saudi Arabia. Someone like me is now as trusted as a scientist. So it fundamentally changes the dynamics about how we're going to make decisions, how we influence the conversation around technology like gene editing or other technology that we introduce across the food system. This was from Pew in March of last year. The percentage of people who say when it comes to important issues facing the country, Republican and Democratic voters not only disagree on plans and policies, but also cannot agree on basic facts. 80% of Americans, 80% of the respondents agreed with that. So we no longer have facts, we have red facts and blue facts, right? And across the microcultures, we have a whole lot of other facts that then make it incredibly difficult to create a common understanding, much less agreement or consensus on a whole range of different topics. So that was the catalyst then for the research we did most recently on the evolution of truth. We always want to express appreciation to our research sponsors, FMI, the grocery store, the Grocers Trade Association, Iowa Farm Bureau, and then others, including the Pork Checkoff, that you can see there as well. The methodology, this is not a quantitative survey. This is a large-scale digital ethnography. So imagine any consumer, their concerns about food and agriculture. We find them across a number of the channels that they're on, whatever platforms they happen to be on. We go back 2 years in their history. We study their social values, political beliefs, where they work, where they live, what they shop, triggers to adopt, triggers to reject, a whole range of different information that we gather from them. And then we replicated that across 4,000 consumers. So that was the methodology for this particular piece of research. We're methodologically agnostic. We'll use whatever we need to accomplish a specific objective. So we identified 5 different consumer segments: the progressive disruptor, the authenticity seeker, the rationalist, the comfort seeker, and the strategist. Those 3 groups in the middle constitute 76% of the population. The reason we chose this methodology is our previous peer-reviewed and published research shows that connecting on values are what drive trust. So rather than simply asking people, do you like or don't like something, this allows us to observe behavior, to better understand beliefs and values as opposed to doing a quantitative survey. Because that's what we were interested in, or what are people's beliefs and values, not just what they're going to say in terms of self-reporting. Again, every methodology has its pros and cons. You could use different methodologies for different objectives to achieve different purposes. We use quantitative, we use qualitative, we use ethnography. So this was really about trying to understand core beliefs, opinions, and solutions. The detailed information we have about consumers, again, not just all the demographic information, but what is true for each segment, each microculture, how they act on their beliefs, their triggers to adopt and reject, the brands that they buy, what they watch, what they read, the influencers they follow. We don't have time to get to this today, but we also have MAHA-specific insights on each of those 5 cohorts as well. So who are these people? We've got the authenticity seeker. They're important because they have influence over others. 14% of the population, 18% share of voice. They want information from sources. They like farmers who have calloused hands and dirty boots. Don't show me a perfectly clean finishing barn with somebody who has a uniform on or coveralls on that don't have shit on them. They're not going to believe it, right? That's not how it works in agriculture. What you share in terms of being authentic and true about what actually happens builds trust with the authenticity seeker. 55-45, female, male, college educated. Pay attention to this. 68% middle class and above. Because when we get to the next segment, you're going to see something very, very different. They work in creative fields like design, childhood education, social work, etc. You will notice, that's a back button, not a pointer, spans age categories. Sometimes people will segment their research based on what does Gen Z say, or what is Gen X doing, or we segment people by belief systems, not by demographics, right? We're looking for people who share common beliefs, and common beliefs oftentimes span generations. So we're not segmenting them by the demographics, we're segmenting them by beliefs. You can see, again, the demographics in terms of race, predominantly white. Pay attention to that because you're going to see something very different when we get to the comfort seeker. We did similar research back in 2017. This cohort did not exist. Culture generally changes relatively slowly unless there's a catalyst that speeds culture change. The pandemic and the cultural dominance of MAGA were both catalysts that sped culture change. So the comfort seeker has emerged as a result of some of those activities. They're 43% of the population, largest group of any of them. You can see for them, truth is about reassurance. My life is full of anxiety. I'm confused by all the conflicting information I get. Somebody please simplify it and just tell me what I should do. Help me make the right choice for myself and my family. They trust, or they did trust, USDA and FDA labels. That's wavering a bit. They trust nutritionists, but they also trust online influencers. Somebody who's empathetic to me, understands my values, my concerns, my issues. They will resonate with me, and therefore I will give them my trust. 90% middle class and below, right? So these folks are struggling to make ends meet, trying to find ways to balance all the different challenges they have in their life. They work in skilled trades, middle management, teaching, stay-at-home parents, also the most ethnically diverse group. 52% white, 16% African American, 21% Hispanic, middle class and below, mostly married with kids, including empty nesters, 50%, suburbs, medium-sized towns, or rural areas. The authenticity seeker is going to live in urban centers, not so the comfort seeker. You can see they have high school and perhaps some technical level of education. So all of that is just kind of context for the conversation that we're going to have around gene editing. We've been doing research on gene editing for probably more than a decade, quantitative, qualitative. This is going to be a quantitative piece of research that I will share with you. But gene editing actually is helping to address some of the more pressing issues we have in society. I want to introduce you to KJ Muldoon. A year ago, this month, he was given a personalized gene therapy. The first human to ever get a personalized gene therapy. He was born with a genetic abnormality that prohibited his body from processing ammonia into urea so it could be eliminated. So he continued to accumulate ammonia, which meant he was not going to live very long. He was born 6 months before they introduced the gene therapy, and the gene therapy was effective. And so he's still alive today and doing well as a 2-ish-year-old boy. If you've had 2-year-olds, you kind of understand the the joy and the challenges that go with having a 2-year-old, but the family was thrilled. What was interesting was it took 6 months, only 6 months, to develop a very specific gene therapy just for him. So the potential of this technology is truly tremendous. Why do we need it in agriculture? Historically, there's been a pretty low felt need for new technology in agriculture. Shelves were full, it wasn't making the evening news, people didn't pay that much attention, but then we had global supply chain disruptions because of the pandemic. We've seen food inflation, global conflicts and instability about what we can access or not access. You've seen disease, coffee prices, chocolate prices spiking, climate change, severe weather events, concerns about animal welfare, farm instability, or sustainability rather, tariffs, and you could add more to the list, right? So all of a sudden now, people are more amenable and interested in technology to solve potential challenges. When you think about gene editing, we like to talk about it in terms of it could be considered software for agriculture, right? Gene editing allows developers to make a precise change in the genome to achieve a beneficial outcome without introducing foreign DNA. That's a key consideration. When we've done a lot of work on this, we know that having the ability to talk about not introducing foreign DNA is important. So, like software, producers, farmers can make a decision about what software you want to use, what technology you want to apply on your farm, based on your needs, based on your market, based on whatever your preference happens to be. You are all empowered to make individual decisions on your operation about what technology you will or will not embrace. Gene editing, however, is democratizing biotechnology. Unlike the first generation, which was very restrictive because of the cost of development and getting it through the regulatory process, it's very different with gene editing. More than 3,600 applications being developed in human medicine, like for our friend KJ, about half of those target cancer. Who in this room doesn't know someone or have had a family member that was impacted by cancer? Anybody? Yeah. So all of a sudden now, this becomes very personal, something that's very relatable, because we all know people who've been impacted by something that could be addressed. There are more than 500 applications coming to market in agriculture. Pork industry is focused on one application today, I understand that, but there are more than 500 coming to market that retailers and food service are considering. You can see how they're being divided in terms of pre-commercialization, products developed in grains or seed oils, veg, fruit, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So these are some of the applications coming to market, from asparagus to yams and everything in between. We're working with retailers and others, and you'll hear a little bit more about that later, on helping them develop a framework to decide what they do and do not want in their specific supply chain. You've got to make decisions in the pork industry about this particular application, but what I would encourage you to do is understand the potential of the technology, right? You may or may not like the PRRS-resistant pig, but what if there was a gene edit that could add 20% intramuscular fat to the loin? That would be something you might say, that's pretty decent. We might like that technology, right? So I would just caution you, as you debate this particular application, as well you should, be careful about saying we don't want the enabling technology to be available to our industry. Because as you can see, it's becoming very prolific across all of agriculture. Okay, so that takes us specifically to the research that we did on gene editing acceptance. And again, this was work we did last year in August, I believe it was. We released it in October. We've done this in partnership with FMI, the Trade Association for Grocery Retailers. We do a lot of work in partnership with them. Obviously, their members are very interested in consumer acceptance of this technology as well. So the background and methodology, the hypothesis was, and we saw this from previous research, that really it's about the perceived benefit. If I perceive the benefit to be meaningful enough to me, I will accept the technology. If I don't believe the benefit has meaning to me or something I care about, I won't. Anybody in the room not have a smartphone? Did you buy the smartphone because of how the chips were manufactured? No. You bought the smartphone because of what it enables you to do, right? So similarly, the background technology, our hypothesis was, is less important than what the technology actually delivers to consumers or to society. It's about the benefits. So we tested 4 different technologies, 2 in animals, 2 in plants. The 2 in animals were the PRRS-resistant pig and a hypothetical high-path avian influenza laying hen. The 2 in plants were a high GABA tomato. High GABA tomatoes reduce blood pressure naturally, and a non-browning banana. So the benefits we were testing were public health, animal welfare, personal health benefits, reduced cost and stabilized supply with a high-path avian influenza laying hen, and reduced food waste. So those were the benefits that we were testing through those 4 different applications of gene editing. This is the methodology. It's an eye chart. All of this is available to anybody who wants it. Basically 18 to 70, we worked with Circana. They've got a purchase likelihood and willingness to pay kind of tool, most important benefit, message believability, et cetera. One thing I'll caution about willingness to pay, we use that as a proxy for acceptance because there's a very low correlation between stated purchasing intent and actual purchasing behavior, right? When people respond to surveys, often their altruistic self responds, and then they go to the grocery store and their economic self kicks in. If you were just looking at surveys, everybody would buy organic cage-free eggs, right? Not the way it works. So you have to make sure that you understand the willingness to pay and incremental willingness to pay more. Think of it as a proxy for acceptance, not something that would translate into direct economic activity. So the model that Circana has developed based on over 6,200 studies in terms of likelihood benchmarks, 88% or above, high likelihood of happening. Between 82 and 87, participants indicate a directional preference of likelihood of the concept. 76 to 81, kind of a coin toss, right? Nothing fell below that. So we did A/B testing because we wanted to understand, was there going to be an impact on giving them information and education about gene editing, or was it really just about the benefits? What we found was there might have been a little impact by the information, but it's really about the benefits, right? So educating the public is not going to be what drives acceptance. It's going to be to help them understand that the benefit is meaningful to me, right? If this is meaningful enough to me, then the technology is simply a means to that end, right? So if you have a seedless blackberry or seedless raspberry that's coming to market and I'm really tired of getting those little seeds caught in my teeth, then the technology is simply a means to the end of achieving that outcome. So that was the basic hypothesis. This is the stimulus that we use for all 4 technologies. Again, all of this is available to anybody who wants it. Pork Board has it. You can reach out to me and I'm happy to share it with you. Again, our role is to help encourage conversation and discussion. Key findings and recommendations as we move forward. So you see here that pork without introduction, tomatoes with introduction, and bananas with the introduction all scored very well. So statistically, they're the same. Pork was a little bit better, 84%. The question that people responded to, will people definitely buy pork with gene editing, or pork with from the PRRS-resistant pig, tomatoes that are high GABA, bananas that don't brown, produced this way? 84% of the respondents said yes to pork, 83% to tomatoes with the intro, 81% to bananas with the intro. Now the green line is how strongly do you feel about your prediction on a scale of 0 to 10, right? So if I'm pretty darn confident that people are going to buy pork that comes from a PRRS-resistant pig or tomatoes that are high in GABA, then I'm going to rate it closer to 10, right? So you can see that high level of that 84% said people will definitely buy pork produced in this way, 83% tomatoes produced in this way, 81% bananas produced in this way, and then you can see the strength of that belief. So you can see that for this audience, pork did pretty well, right? Based on that particular benefit to society in terms of improved animal welfare, reduced antibiotic use, reduced impact on the environment, et cetera, et cetera. So based on the stimulus, you can see that when we talk about benefits, not just the technology, then the acceptance increases. The technology is described in every stimulus. Right? So I don't want to leave you with the impression that gene editing was not discussed or described. It was, but we also talked about it in the context of the benefits. Now those 3 are statistically different than tomatoes with no intro, bananas with no intro, eggs with no intro, and eggs with the intro. When we asked about, do you believe the information we shared with you, again, you can see high believability scores. And again, the question was, will people find the statements made about X produced in this way to be completely believable? Eggs, tomatoes, eggs, pork, all did relatively well. You can see that, and then down on the list, F and G were the only 2 that were statistically different on believability. All right, in the interest of time, I'm just going to cover pork here. I'll go through the other ones. But basically, again, the purchase likelihood score, 84%, and then the strength of that score, 10. 46% not willing to pay any more, which means that a majority said they would be willing to pay more. 35% approved by the FDA to be safe and effective. That's the most important benefit. Notice at the very bottom, importance of FDA approval, 84% extremely or somewhat important. That was true across the board. Government approval of the application was important regardless of the application. They want to make sure somebody's watching the store, that it's gone through enough testing to be able to come onto the market. 73% were extremely or very satisfied with the information we provided. Then we said, if you want more information, where do you want to go? 78% said on the package itself. Everyone will say, if I want more information, I want it on the package. Those who package products are loath to give up a centimeter of a label for anything other than marketing. So how do we empower people? How do we give consumers agency to access the information that's important to them without putting it on the label? Because whether it's, this is an emotionally charged topic for this audience, so say it's tomatoes, not pork, right? How would we empower people, give them agency to access that information? Lots of different ways to do that. We've just had some conversations with GS1. GS1 is the company that does barcodes. The current barcode has 13 data points. They're moving to a 2D barcode, which will have 5,000. Which will then empower you to be able to scan the barcode and find out all kinds of information. We did a whole bunch of work on GMO labeling, asking consumers about what they'd want and where they want the information. What we found was consumers want to be empowered to go look. Very few will, but they want the ability to go find it, right? So if it's not available to them, they will feel like you're hiding the ball in some form or fashion. So you've got to find a way to make it available. But again, retailers and manufacturers will be loath to give up label space regardless of what it happens to be about. Similarly on tomatoes and eggs, you're going to see bananas, all the different things. One thing I will point out is if you were seeking additional information, what would your preferred phrase be on the pack? So for bananas, it was 35% stays fresher longer. We gave them a whole range of different statements or information that they might want to have available on the package. And it varied dramatically by the consumer, right? So there's no way you're going to be able to have all of that information available on a pack. So what are the other ways that we can find to empower consumers to get the information that's important to them? So 3 quick takeaways. Gene editing is bringing measurable, meaningful benefits to consumers and society. The benefits will drive acceptance. Applications are bringing improvements to every sector of the food system. The rate of the application introduction is increasing dramatically. Again, 500 plus in development, there will be more after that. So the food system is going to be working on strategies for gene editing acceptance. We are actually helping them with that. We are working on a framework to help food system stakeholders evaluate how to integrate food and ingredients derived from gene editing into their supply chain. We're agnostic about what any retailer or food company decides to accept or does not try to accept. But as we've had a conversation with retailers, what we want to try to avoid is the produce manager having one policy, the dairy manager having a second policy, and the meat merchant having a third policy. And then all of a sudden they become a target for somebody in the conversation because they don't have a unified policy about what they will and will not accept. So we're not going to advocate for any specific outcome, but we want to give them tools to make decisions that are consistent with their brand, their values, their shoppers, etc. We'll have more time after Andy for questions and conversation. I will always respond to emails or phone calls or texts. And so please feel free to reach out for more information if you'd like. We'll talk soon. Thanks.
So, good morning. Andy Tower. I have the pleasure of serving as the Vice President of International Marketing at the National Pork Board. For many of you, might be the first time I've had the opportunity to speak in front of you. Joined the Pork Board about 8 months ago after spending about 20 years working in the ag organizational space. I've had the opportunity to lead a policy shop at Indiana Farm Bureau and spent about 9 to 10 years working for the corn and soybean industries back in Indiana, where I first got to work with Charlie on some of the work at CFI. So it's a real pleasure to be here this morning. My family and I still live on a small family farm west of Indianapolis, and so deeply ingrained in the industry, and really we want to kind of walk through some work that that not only the National Pork Board has put together, but also the U.S. Meat Export Federation. As we talk about this topic, and we know, I mean, how much it means to this industry. I mean, our goal is to put some information in front of you so the producers can make the choice that best fits their business decisions. And so, to really start this disclaimer, I mean, at the National Pork Checkoff and the National Pork Board, we sell nothing, we own nothing, and this information is just truly here for you to help you make a choice. And we will not and cannot take a position on this issue. And I think that's very important. I mean, what we're putting in front of you today is just, we're sharing the data, the information. And so a little bit of the approach. And a few years ago, the National Pork Board set up a gene editing task force to really start talking about gene editing in general and what's it mean to the industry. The board adopted a gene editing policy. And that policy is we are pro-technology. But secondarily, one of the things in that is we have to understand what the technology is going to do to the business. And then ultimately, for those of you that were at the May USMEF meeting, there was a lot of conversation around this topic amongst their exporters, and ultimately a resolution came forward for USMEF to dig into what's this mean in the international arena. So ultimately, our board of directors spent a lot of time back in September debating what should we do. And ultimately, they decided we need to know what the U.S. consumer thinks about this technology. And so we worked with our team on our business intelligence team and a lot of folks around National Pork Board to set up a survey, and with 3 objectives in mind. Assess the overall awareness of gene-edited pork. Oops. And we're back. Establish a baseline of those reactions, and then explore the emotional reactions about on-pack label and some other things. And so we worked with a group called CNR, and this is a group, as you heard from Jose and Neil earlier, that the organization spent a lot of time with building out and some of the data intelligence behind the Taste What Pork Can Do campaign. And so we surveyed over 6,000 U.S. Shoppers. It was an online survey, and it was in the marketplace late Q4 25. And so one of the things I think is really important to us in terms of the pork industry, this looks at those consumer segments that a lot of the Taste What Pork Can Do is focused on. And so trying to be able to build that baseline to really understand how it plays into some of the other areas that we're investing your dollars in. And so this is where I think this research in terms of pork and the investment and what we're doing in the industry is very important. Because we know that all consumers don't receive information the same way. Very similar to some of the different segmentation that Charlie spoke about in his work. We know that there's a group, about 18% of the consumers, that are just blissfully unaware. And so they are going to see labels, and that's about all they're going to care about. We've got the largest group, 44%, read the headlines. And they're going to see top-level data and look at it, and they're going to start making choices based on that. And then we've got about 38% that really wants to dig in. These are the folks that truly want to know where their food comes from, what's in it, how it's raised, all the things. They want to know all the attributes. And so as we look at these data sets, this is how we started to dice this up. And so, again, much like some of the information you heard from Charlie, we wanted to get a sense of the baseline before there was any stimulus or any information given to the consumer or the survey respondents. And then let's look at it and how it changes on the post side. And so we were very deliberate about this. I mean, we had hours upon hours of conversation about how we draft these questions and those type of things. So we were truly trying to get the best sense we could of the true consumer reaction to this. And so largely, consumers are unaware of any advances made in food science. Only about 32% are aware of the food science technology. And so you can see some of the top responses: 13% alternative proteins, cultivated lab-grown meats, 6% were aware of GMO and bioengineering, another 6% different processing level ingredients, food dyes, and a lot. You have to think about some of the other conversations in the food system that driving some of that. 5% on production technologies, artificial intelligence, and 4% no health and nutrition content. And as we continue to dig into this a little bit more, as you think about, we ask the question, familiarity of disease-reducing science, gene editing technology specifically. Only 22% were aware of new advances in food science and technology. And of that, only 31% know a lot or a little about gene editing. So overall, before we give any stimulus, the general knowledge of the technology is very low. And so then we want to get a sense of the consideration of gene editing pork as a large, consistent, whether examined through the lens of eating, purchasing at retail, or at food service. And you can see across the board, it's almost a 50-50 coin flip. Whether folks are open or hesitant to eating it at home, purchasing it at the retail, or ordered in food service. But what do consumers want? And again, very similar to some of the information you heard from Charlie, they want to be assured that it is safe. And that came across all three of those attitudinal groups. That was the top issue. And that really is not a surprise to most of you in this room. And so the research findings from the National Pork Board, domestic work, overall low awareness. Only 31% of the consumers are familiar with gene-edited animals. And so, again, that's pretty consistent across the board. Low consideration. About 25% were open to purchasing meat that comes from animals that have been gene-edited. Low acceptance. And I think this is one that 16% of Gen X and boomers, who are your core pork consumers, are open to the idea of gene-edited. Significant number were hesitant and uncertain. And then education only offered marginal gains. And so this is the work that National Pork Board funded, and it was, like I say, it was in the marketplace late Q4. There's been some activities that have occurred since then, but this is our first shot on goal to get some idea where our U.S. consumers are at on this topic. And so now I'm going to transition, and I'm going to talk about some of the international data. And this work was done by the U.S. Meat Export Federation. It was not funded with checkoff dollars. And they utilized a group called FTI International. Some of you folks may know one of their principals, Polly Rulon, spent some time at the U.S. Soy Checkoff, spent some time on the cattleman side of the business. But we'll walk through some of their data, and we're just here as USMEF is one of our huge partners, especially in the international market arena. They'd asked us to share this with you all, as I believe most of their teams in Taiwan this week for a staff conference. And so they looked at 4 major countries. And so they surveyed about 1,000 consumers in each. And so they looked at Mexico, Canada, Japan, and Colombia. I think for many of you in this room, there's no secret why those 4 countries are on the list. I mean, our top 3 exporting markets, and then Colombia, this is a country where the technology has been approved, and this is a country that's also emerging as a very, very strong customer of U.S. pork. And so given these countries, I mean, all 4 very diverse geographically, And from a demographic, so this slide here just shows that, I mean, they did a really good job of getting a very good cross-section of consumers in all 4 of these international markets to be able to discern their thoughts and views on this topic as well. And again, you're going to see some key themes here from what we saw in the domestic work. Across all 4 markets, about 51% of the consumers are ambivalent to the technology. Labeling, and they asked some very specific labeling questions in the international survey. Labeling is essential. Naturalness is one that you'll see later that comes up. And this really, in Canada and Japan, there's a lot of confusion about where gene editing fits in this naturalness conversation. And then what's in it for them? That consumer benefit, again, as Charlie talked about in some of their work, really digging into and identifying what the consumer benefit is for this technology in the international arena. And so this is overall openness to buy foods made from new tech. And so over on the left-hand side, this is very open to open. And you can see that middle, that ambivalence, really kind of comes out across all 4 major markets. And then as we had some of the responses in some of the open-ended questions, about 25% of the comments associated with food preservatives, concerns about health and safety came in at 15%, 14% alternative meats and lab-grown food, and then 1% responses mentioned gene editing, less than. And so again, as we think about where this technology fits in your businesses, the overall awareness at the consumer level is low at this time. And then at the bottom of the slide here, this is a stimulus that the consumers in the international market were given to educate them on gene editing. And you can see across all 4 of the markets, there was only a slight move after they were educated. So in Mexico, the unsure went from 60 to 54, Colombia 60 to 55, Canada 68 to 63, and Japan 80 to 73. And so it does move, but again, much like we saw in the domestic work, that education only moves the needle marginally. Labeling. As I mentioned, there were some clear labeling questions asked in the international, and you can see very, very significantly here that it is going to be very important if this technology is in the marketplace in the international arenas that it will need to be labeled. And again, just some top label concerns that are noted here on the side for each of the markets. In Mexico, clear statement that pork is gene edited. In Colombia, government or regulatory seal of approval. Canada, clear statement, pork is gene edited. And same thing for Japan. And so this is, as I mentioned earlier, one of the kind of key findings here in the international work was this notion of naturalness. And so what you're really looking at here is the difference, the delta between the blue square or green square and blue triangle. Because the blue square is conventional raised pork and gene edited is the blue triangle. And so there's some wide differences spreads here, but in Japan, gene edited is viewed as more unnatural than lab grown or GMO. And then as we look at some other perceptions in terms of sustainability and animal welfare, we start to get a much tighter spread in those attributes. And so again, this is very similar trends to the work that Charlie did as well. So again, we're starting to build some themes in terms of this gene editing work. And top benefits. So in Mexico, better animal welfare, antibiotic reductions in Colombia and Canada, and safe to eat in Japan. And some of their top concerns, unknown effects across the board and health and safety risk in Japan. And so again, we're not making any claims, we're not putting a stake in the sand, pro or con. What we're trying to do is make sure you and your businesses have the information to make the best business decision as we go forward in this discussion. Because we all know we're early on in this overall discussion of gene editing. And so for the USMEF information, if you do have further questions or want to dig further into the methodology, Aaron Bohr, their chief economist, has kind of been tapped as their go-to resource to answer questions. And then here's a slide that shows both for National Pork Board and the USMEF where to seek information. If you want to dig into the methodology on the National Pork Board, the domestic consumer research, Kirsten Hafer on our team, that's her wheelhouse, and she's great at being able to dig into that and unpack it for you all. But again, we're just trying to provide you some recent information so you all can make your own business decisions. So with that, Charlie, I think we're ready to answer questions if folks have any.
Jamie, are you our mic runner? Yep. All right, if you got questions, raise your hand, and Jamie will get a microphone to you.
Use the lectern, we're going to have to use that. Should be in the room.
Here's another one that might work.
Thank you. Watermelon. What technology was used to come up with the seedless watermelon?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question.
What type of technology was used to come up with the seedless watermelon? Is that correct?
Yes.
Oh, that was old technology. That was GMOs, that was irradiation, some other technology. Yeah, but we've been using lots of different technology to modify genome for quite some time.
So how was that perceived at the time it was being developed in the consumers?
I don't have any information on that.
Okay, thank you.
I'm not sure if you stated in the domestic research what the thoughts were on the need for a label or lack thereof. On USMEF, that was done.
So we specifically didn't dig deep into the label component in the domestic conversation. There was in the summary piece, there was one notation about on pack, but we purposely did not dig into that deeply.
Let me just comment a little bit more about labeling. Again, we did a lot of work on the whole GMO labeling, and we do a lot of work across a wide range of issues outside of gene editing. What consumers want is transparency and the ability to access information that's important to them, right? As a retailer or a consumer packaged goods company, I don't have enough space unless I include a CVS receipt on every package to provide the information that might be of interest to every single consumer. And so that's where, when you're talking with the retail community and others, they really want to be able to rely on technology to give agency to consumers to find the information that's relevant to them, whether it's about gene editing or forced labor or environment because the number of ways that consumers access information, the kinds of information they're looking for continues to increase. Label space is remaining constant. And so how do we continue to empower them to find other ways to get the information that's important to them? Very quiet room. That's not a good sign.
Do you see a parallel between our discussion on this and our experience with BST 20 or 25 years ago?
Yeah, absolutely. Anytime we've introduced, there's some good learnings around previous technology introduction, right? Historically, we've tried to educate consumers, we've tried to give them information, we've tried to defend the technology, and we've talked about the fact that it's safe. The average grocery store has over 40,000 SKUs, right? 40,000 products. So if you come to me as a retailer and you say, well, I want you to stock my product because it's safe, like, I assume everything in my store is safe. That's not a reason for me to sell it, right? There needs to be some perceived need that you are meeting or some benefit that you are offering. So we're not going to educate people, we're not going to educate the public into buying this or not buying it. It's all going to be about the perceived benefit and the value it delivers to me or something that I care about. So I think we have a paradigm shift, an opportunity for a paradigm shift to move away from education and to move into engagement and a focus on benefits that are demonstrable and meaningful to the people who care about the topic. The other thing that, I mean, awareness is incredibly low right now, which means there's pretty much a blank slate for us to have a conversation, if we want to, with the consuming public about this technology. So that's another reason, I think, to tread a little bit carefully about what we decide to do or not do, because the technology will continue to proliferate regardless of what the pork industry chooses to do with this one application.
Back of the room, Jamie.
Thanks for the information. Consumer research is a point in time. And so are there milestones that you've identified that if this happens, we want to repeat? Or have you talked about a frequency of retesting to understand how sentiment might be changing around the technology?
Yeah, great question. So obviously the research needs to be repeated on a regular basis. The other thing that I'll tell you is that we've used agentic AI to create digital twins for each of those 5 cohorts. So we can now query the twins, right? So rather than having to go back in the field, we can ask questions of the twins because we have that deep anthropological and sociological information about them as a group, right? All of what they consider to be true, what they read, what they follow. It's not just the answer to a question, but we know a lot about them as a group. So we can use agentic AI to continue to create the digital twins and then train the twins to go out and continue to scrape and find their own information so we can continue to query them. We're doing that right now in beta, and it's pretty interesting in terms of the insight we get from them without having to replicate new and costly research.
So from the pork board perspective, we just had the opportunity in January to share the data with our board of directors, and quite frankly, this group is the first large group we've shared the information with. So I anticipate it'll be a conversation that our board will continue to have and make that decision when they do see fit to re-engage the research.
Yeah, Paul?
What are the benefits that the Gen Z and Gen Xers are looking for? You talked about benefits as a whole.
Yeah.
More specific to different demographics.
Yeah, so the question was, what benefits are Gen Z and Gen X looking for specifically? One thing I'll tell you is younger demographics are more open to technology to solve problems in agriculture. When we look at this more broadly, younger consumers are very comfortable with technology being used to solve a lot of issues. So it's going to be environment, animal welfare, the kinds of things that you might expect from younger consumers. The other thing we found was that heavier users of each of these products were also more accepting, which was a bit surprising to me, that heavier consumers of pork or bananas or apple or whatever would be the ones who would also be more supportive of the gene-edited version of that technology. But it kind of makes sense, right? I already like this product, I like this benefit, therefore I'm more likely to be supportive of the benefit because I'm already using a lot of this.
I may have missed that, but was there any indication that the price would change the opinion of those consumers?
Yeah, so we did look at willingness to pay and willingness to pay more. For pork, 46%, it was either 46 or 43%, said they would not be willing to pay more, which means that a slight majority said they would be willing to pay more. But again, I would caution, that's not a good indicator of what people are actually going to be willing to pay, right? Because there's a very low correlation between stated purchasing intent and actual purchasing behavior. So you'd have to do much more complicated methodology to actually be able to do any kind of pricing prediction. This is basically an indicator of acceptance. Do not take any of this information in terms of a willingness to pay more or less for any of those products.
And the National Pork Board nor the USMEF study had anything in terms of willingness to pay in their surveys.
We've been at 50 pounds demand forever. Is there any, from any of the work you did here, is there any opportunity to grow demand?
So the question was, we've been at 50 pounds demand for quite some while, and is there an opportunity in some of this work to grow demand? That was, I mean, I think that's a conversation that the National Pork Board and our officers and our staff are having daily. Specifically to this work, that's not a question that we really dug into. We're trying, again, just trying to set the baseline to then have an understanding how we take this from here. But demand is something that we are focused on a daily basis, whether it be our domestic work that Jose and Neil shared earlier, the work I get to do in the international arena.
Yeah, in previous work that we've done, basically taste, price, convenience are still the drivers, right? So it's not going to be a reason to buy, but it might be a reason not to buy, depending upon that individual consumer. We also did research with retailers in terms of what would drive their acceptance, and are you meeting a felt need for them, right? Is there some reason for them to go, my pork case is already full, or I've got all the tomatoes I need, why would I replace an existing SKU with a different SKU? So there's got to be some benefit to them. And then the number one thing is, can you demonstrate that my customer's going to buy it? Because if my customer's not going to buy it, I'm not putting it on the shelf.
Have you looked at the other side of the equation? If we lose, I mean, I'm not for or against, but if we happen to lose market opportunities in foreign countries or domestic consumption, and we have whatever the X number of PRRS pigs that don't leave the inventory anymore, if you looked at what the potential impact could be on the market price received if we lose some market share and we have way more pigs in inventory.
I mean, I hear exactly what you're saying. I think that's a great question. That's not something we have looked at National Pork Board. We'll leave that to the economist that many of you all work with to kind of unpack that one, but that's a great question.
Really good data on the acceptance in Japan, Mexico, and Canada. Any reactions from packers with that data just released?
So I don't know if packers have had the opportunity to see the data. I do know Aaron Bohr at USMEF led a call last week with their exporter committee to share this with them, because really a lot of the work that is being driven there comes from the exporter committee and their resolution back in May. It was a robust conversation, but I don't know if the packers specifically have had a chance at this time to dig into the data sets. Any other questions? Seeing none, thank you all for your time and attention today and our opportunity to visit with you.